Why did no one bother learning her name? The cold April wind cut across the ridge like it had something to prove, snapping at sleeves and tugging at rifle slings. The SEAL platoon lined up with the easy confidence of men who had done this 100 times before. Jokes passed quietly, familiar insults, the kind born from comfort, not cruelty. At the far end of the firing line stood a girl no one bothered to acknowledge. 19, slight, still. Her name sat on the clipboard as an attachment. Observation only. Aria Monroe didn't correct anyone when they referred to her that way. She kept her eyes forward as Lieutenant Mason Rohr walked past without looking at her. She heard the comment about her looking like she stocked shelves at the base exchange. She heard the laughter that followed. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Mockery didn't require volume when everyone agreed. She adjusted the strap of her old spotting scope instead. It wasn't issued. It had scratches around the housing, tape where the paint had worn thin. She bought it herself months earlier when the Army paperwork lagged behind her reality. That detail didn't matter to anyone else. They saw the scope and decided what kind of shooter owned it. They saw her age and decided the rest. Aria felt the wind on her cheek and studied it without moving her head. She watched how dust lifted, how heat shimmer bent just slightly over the far ridge. Mirage mattered more than flags. She learned that the hard way. The first shooter stepped up, confident, decorated. He adjusted elevation using last season's numbers and sent the round. It broke wide. The second corrected and missed again. The wind refused to cooperate. Irritation spread down the line. Aria stayed quiet. When it was finally her turn, it felt less like permission and more like dismissal. Someone joked they'd let the admin rep play if there was time. She didn't smile. She didn't rush. She settled behind the rifle with the calm of someone stepping into something familiar, not something intimidating. She breathed once through her teeth. The shot landed dead center. The silence that followed was not admiration. It was confusion. Someone laughed and said, "Luck." She adjusted the micro dial by a fraction so small most didn't notice. The second shot struck nearly the same point. Now the silence carried weight. Questions formed, but pride smothered them before they reached mouths. Rohr asked what deployment qualified her to make corrections. It wasn't curiosity. It was a trap. "I don't have anything worth your time, sir," she answered. It sounded like surrender. It was. By late afternoon, mockery had thinned into something less comfortable. Not respect, discomfort. Aria felt it settle around her like pressure change before weather breaks. She didn't look up when conversation stopped as she passed. She didn't enjoy it. She had learned early that recognition arrived too late to be useful. Smoke grenades rolled across the range, swallowing the horizon. Visibility dropped. Shooters went prone. Aria stayed kneeling. Someone scoffed. Kneeling reduced stability. Everyone knew that. Aria knew when prone made things worse. Her posture looked wrong to those who hadn't fired from loose rock, from narrow ledges, from ground that betrayed you mid-recoil. She folded the bipod inward instead of widening it. The ground sloped just enough to twist the rifle if she didn't. Staff Sergeant Noah Wells noticed. He noticed the relaxed support hand, the controlled breath, the wrist wrap softened from repeated shock absorption. He didn't say anything. The smoke thickened. Shots rang out. Aria read wind not from flags but from the bend of heat above terrain. Someone asked what school taught her that. "No formal school," she said. Disbelief followed. It always did. Then the radio cracked. A forward element was pinned behind a shifted ridge shelf in the training valley. Overwatch had lost corridor visibility. The angles were wrong. The weather front made everything worse. Time started to matter. Instructors ran numbers. Nothing aligned. Standard grids failed because the ground had moved just enough to lie. Aria stepped forward without asking. "What's the wind index?" she asked. Someone laughed. Distance mattered more than wind, they said. Not at 4 miles, she replied quietly. Wind drives first. Wells raised a hand. Silence followed. Arya studied the haze like it was a language she hadn't forgotten. She wrote a small correction on the board. 1 arrow, 1 number. It looked careless. It was. The first shots landed usable. Relief came through the radio, unpolished and real. Who made that call? No one answered. When the next correction restored full corridor visibility, coincidence became harder to argue. Silence deepened. Pride retreated. Then a vehicle door slammed. Lieutenant Colonel Griffin Hale stepped onto the ridge. His eyes found Arya immediately. "What unit did you rotate through last winter?" he asked. "Sierra Outpost, sir." Recognition crossed his face, the kind that didn't ask for proof. "You completed Cycle 3, he said. Vulture 119. No one laughed. The 4-mile shot came later, when the weather narrowed opportunity to a single window. Arya took it without ceremony. The round traveled unseen until the radio confirmed safe movement. Exposure nullified. No applause followed. Arya cleared her rifle and walked away. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence feel heavier than the mockery ever had? The range didn't erupt after her second shot. No one cheered. No one challenged her outright either. The laughter simply stopped. Arya felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in posture, the way shoulders angled away from her now instead of toward her. Disbelief didn't dissolve into respect. It hardened into something quieter, something more defensive. She stepped back from the rifle and cleared it without being told. Habit. Discipline. She placed it down with the same care she would have if no one were watching, especially if no one were watching. Lieutenant Rohr didn't thank her. He didn't reprimand her either. He flipped a page on his clipboard as if the last 2 minutes hadn't disrupted the rhythm of his authority, but his jaw tightened. Arya noticed that. She noticed small things, always had. The wind shifted again, colder now, sliding down from the ridge like a reminder that conditions never stayed loyal for long. The next shooter took position, confidence forced back into place like armor that didn't quite fit anymore. He missed, adjusted, missed again. Arya said nothing. She could feel eyes on her back, waiting for her to offer a correction. She didn't, not because she couldn't, but because unsolicited truth rarely landed clean. She had learned that lesson early, long before uniforms and ranks tried to teach it again. Travis Hale broke the quiet first. He circled behind her with the casual entitlement of someone used to being right by volume alone. He commented on her stance, her elbow angle, the way her boots sat on the gravel. He spoke like an instructor, not because he was one, but because correcting her restored something he'd lost when her rounds landed true. "Textbook says your center of gravity's off," he said. "You're compensating wrong." Arya listened. She always listened. Silence had never meant weakness to her. It meant control. She didn't explain that textbooks didn't account for unstable gradients or partial rock shear beneath soil. She didn't explain that she'd learned to shoot where prone got people killed because recoil slid rifles inches at a time. She let him finish. When he was done, she adjusted the scope housing, not to correct her position but to prepare for what came next. Her fingers moved with familiarity, not defiance. Staff Sergeant Wells watched from the spotting area, arms folded, gaze sharp. He trained hundreds of shooters. He knew the difference between improvised confidence and earned stillness. Arya's movements didn't rush. They didn't hesitate either. They landed exactly where they needed to, then stopped. As the afternoon stretched, the energy along the line grew brittle. Conversations shortened when she approached. Jokes found other targets. No one apologized. Apologies came later, if at all. The smoke grenades changed everything. They rolled low across the range, thick gray swallowing distance until targets became suggestion rather than certainty. The drill transitioned into low-visibility firing without ceremony. This was supposed to be routine. controlled difficulty, but the wind had other plans. Most shooters dropped prone, anchoring elbows, tightening cheek welds. Arya didn't. She lowered into a kneeling position, weight balanced, spine angled just enough to absorb recoil without fighting it. It looked wrong. Someone scoffed. Kneeling reduced stability at distance. Everyone knew that. Arya knew when prone lied. The ground beneath them wasn't level. It only looked that way until recoil revealed the truth. She folded the bipod inward again, reducing lateral slip. Dust clung to her sleeves as the smoke thickened. She breathed once, through her teeth, measured. Wells noticed the wrist wrap then, faded, softened, reinforced beneath cloth tape. Not decorative, functional. The kind worn by people who fired until joints remembered before minds did. He stepped closer without interrupting. Another instructor, McCree, joined him. They didn't speak. They watched. Arya didn't read the flags. She read the air. Heat shimmer bent unevenly above the slope, curling in subtle arcs that betrayed deeper currents. She tracked those, not the fabric flutter designed for calmer days. A shot rang out nearby. Miss. Another closer, still wrong. Someone asked her where she'd learned to read mirage like that. His tone carried challenge, not curiosity. No formal school, she said again. The disbelief returned, louder now because it needed to be. Someone muttered that no one shot like this without instruction. Arya didn't argue. Arguing wasted oxygen. The radio crackled sharply enough to cut through the smoke. Static first, then urgency. A forward element running an extended lane in the training valley had lost overwatch visibility. Terrain shift, partial slide. Not catastrophic, but enough to erase clean angles. The weather front pressing through the hills thickened the air, turning optics unreliable. Time started shrinking. Instructors gathered around maps and boards. Elevation grids didn't match reality anymore. Reference points lied. Someone suggested switching sides of the range. Someone else pointed out the delay that would cost. Exposure time mattered. Arya stepped forward without permission. "What's the wind index?" she asked. A nearby shooter laughed. "Distance mattered more than wind," he said. "At those ranges, elevation ruled." "Not at 4 miles," Arya replied quietly. "Wind drives first." The sentence didn't sound dramatic. It didn't need to. Wells lifted a hand. No one interrupted her again. She stared into the valley haze like she was listening to something only she could hear. Heat shimmer bent differently where terrain dipped. She traced those invisible lines in her mind, remembering places where wind played cruel tricks, remembering nights when guessing wrong meant more than embarrassment. She picked up the marker and wrote a small correction on the board. 1 arrow, 1 number, nothing else. Someone muttered that it was incomplete. She hadn't even measured distance. Arya stepped back. The correction went out anyway. The first 3 rounds landed where they needed to, tight, usable. The radio responded with relief edged by disbelief. Who made that call? No one answered. 15 minutes of exposure vanished. Corridor visibility returned. Coincidence became harder to defend. Arya didn't react. She capped her scope and waited. Lieutenant Rohr shook his head, searching for a version of reality that fit better. Travis Hale offered excuses aloud, reshaping facts into something less threatening. The wind must have steadied. The shift couldn't have been that big. No one truly believed him. The next phase required anticipation, not correction, predicting movement before it happened. The instructors hesitated. Their old markers were still wrong. Arya already had her finger on the board. She paused, not calculating, not scanning, but remembering. She marked a second correction just as small. The radio confirmed it again. Corridor open, visibility restored. No one clapped. Silence settled differently now, not mocking, not defensive, uneasy. The kind that comes when certainty fractures but pride hasn't yet let go. Arya felt it press against her chest. She didn't enjoy it. Recognition carried weight she hadn't asked for. She stayed still as the valley haze shifted again, as if the land itself were testing whether she would doubt what she knew. She didn't. Some truths didn't need announcing. They waited, patient, until the moment demanded them. And that moment was coming. Why did recognition arrive only when it could no longer be ignored? The silence after the second corridor correction didn't lift when the radio went quiet. It stayed. It settled into the space between people, heavy enough to slow movements, dense enough to bend attention toward one unspoken center. Arya felt it without looking up. She felt it in the way boots stopped shifting, in how no one reached for their phones or joked about the weather. Silence like that wasn't empty. It was processing. Lieutenant Rohr cleared his throat and resumed issuing commands, but the cadence was different now. Less automatic, more careful. Authority didn't vanish, it recalibrated. He didn't look at Arya when he spoke, but he didn't speak over her presence either. That was new. She returned to the firing line without ceremony, resetting her position like someone returning to work rather than claiming a moment. Her heart rate stayed even. It always did when the environment grew tense. Calm had never meant comfort. It meant focus. Staff Sergeant Wells drifted closer again, not invading her space, just close enough to observe. He wanted to ask questions. He didn't. He had learned long ago that people who earned their steadiness rarely explained it well under interrogation. They explained it through repetition. The weather thickened as the afternoon wore on. The ridge swallowed light unevenly, patches of shadow sliding across the terrain like slow-moving doubt. Visibility narrowed in increments too small to alarm anyone outright, but enough to matter if you understood what to look for. Arya did. She adjusted the strap on her scope and glanced toward the valley. The air felt wrong, not dangerous yet, but unsettled. The kind of wrong that preceded consequences if ignored. She felt a familiar tightening behind her ribs, not fear, responsibility. A new transmission crackled in. The forward element had begun repositioning along the slope, using the restored corridor, but cloud bands were dropping faster than anticipated. The route was still passable, but only if timing stayed clean. Any hesitation would compress margins until they vanished. Rohr looked at the board again. The numbers still didn't sit right with him. They didn't align with doctrine. He trusted doctrine. Doctrine had kept him alive. Arya trusted patterns. He hesitated, for just a second, long enough for Wells to speak. "Let her run Overwatch," Wells said quietly. It wasn't a recommendation framed as permission. It was an observation framed as inevitability. Rohr glanced up sharply, surprised by himself more than by the suggestion. He studied Arya like he was seeing her for the first time without assumptions filling the gaps. 19. No tabs, no visible decorations. And yet, "Corporal Monroe," he said, "you're on wind and elevation, full responsibility." Arya nodded once. "Yes, sir." No pride surfaced, no vindication. Responsibility didn't feel like reward, it felt like weight. She moved back to the rifle and settled in, kneeling again. The position hadn't changed. The conditions had. She readjusted by millimeters, compensating for fatigue she didn't feel yet but knew would arrive if ignored. She rolled her shoulder once, quiet, precise. Someone behind her whispered that the distance was stretching beyond standard training limits. 4 miles pushed error into exponential territory. Even experienced Overwatch teams avoided committing at that range, unless failure was worse than waiting. Arya didn't respond. She watched the mirage curl, flatten, then curl again. She listened to the wind, not the sound, but the pressure. She let the environment speak first. The forward element radioed again. They were nearing the narrowest section of the corridor, the one that had collapsed partially during the slide. Movement would have to be clean. There would be no second chance. Arya felt a flicker of doubt then, not in her ability, but in timing. Doubt lived in margins. It whispered when variables stacked too tightly. She acknowledged it without letting it steer. She breathed once, through her teeth. Her finger rested alongside the trigger, not on it. Patience mattered more than readiness at this distance. She waited for the wind to hesitate. It always did, briefly, like a held breath before committing. When it came, she adjusted elevation once, barely visible. The rifle felt like an extension of memory rather than muscle. She pressed the trigger. The shot vanished into distance, swallowed by air and time. There was no immediate confirmation, no satisfying clang, just waiting. The radio came alive seconds later. Movement clear, corridor secured, we're through. Relief followed, but it wasn't loud. It was disciplined, professional, the kind that acknowledged danger without celebrating survival prematurely. Arya exhaled slowly and cleared the rifle. No one spoke for a moment, not because they didn't know what to say, but because language felt insufficient. Recognition hadn't arrived with ceremony. It had arrived with results, and results demanded recalibration. Lieutenant Colonel Griffin Hale arrived then, his presence reshaping the air more than the weather had. He didn't ask for reports immediately. He observed first, score sheets, boards, faces, and finally Arya. Something in his posture shifted when his eyes settled on her. Recognition didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it quieted everything else. "What unit did you rotate through last winter?" he asked. Arya answered without hesitation, "Sierra Outpost, sir." The name rippled through the line like a dropped object no one expected to hear. Sierra Outpost wasn't spoken casually. It wasn't assigned accidentally. "You completed Cycle 3, Hale said. Vulture 119. The ridge went still. That call sign carried weight that no rank insignia ever could. It wasn't famous. It wasn't mythologized. It was known only by those who understood what it took to earn it. Hale nodded once. Not a salute, something more equal, more private. Arya accepted it without reaction. Validation arrived too late to change who she was. It only clarified what others now had to accept. The range began to dismantle itself slowly, gear packed, rifles secured, movements quieter than before. No jokes returned to fill space. The atmosphere had shifted permanently. One of the younger shooters stepped toward Arya, offering to carry her bag. She declined gently, not out of pride, out of habit. Roar muttered an apology as he passed. It barely carried over the wind. "No need, sir," Arya replied. "Everyone judges by what they see first." She meant it without accusation. As she walked back toward the vehicles, the ridge behind her held the echo of something unspoken but understood. Experience didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, quiet and patient, until conditions forced truth into the open. And when it did, there was no applause, only acceptance. The hardest part was never proving skill. It was carrying it alone, until the moment arrived that demanded it. What does it cost to be seen? Only after the danger has passed. The ridge began to empty, but the air didn't. Something lingered there, heavier than smoke, heavier than the wind that still combed through the plateau. Arya felt it as she walked, a tension that no longer avoided her, yet didn't quite know how to approach her either. Recognition had arrived, but it hadn't settled into comfort. It rarely did. She loaded her gear into the transport without rushing. Each motion was deliberate, practiced, unremarkable. The kind of movements that came from repetition rather than urgency. No one rushed her now. No one joked about time. The absence of mockery felt louder than the mockery itself ever had. The vehicle ride down from the ridge was quiet. Engines hummed. Equipment rattled softly. Conversation stayed muted, as if everyone was afraid to shatter whatever fragile understanding had formed. Arya stared out the window, watching the terrain roll by, its scars softened by distance. She'd seen worse ground. She'd trusted worse air. Her hands rested on her thighs, fingers still, wrists wrapped. The wrap had started as a precaution. It had become necessity somewhere along the way. She hadn't noticed when. When they reached the staging area, Griffin Hale pulled her aside without ceremony. No audience, no raised voices. "You did well today," he said. Arya nodded. Compliments slid off her more easily than criticism. Praise arrived too late to matter the way people expected it to. "You shouldn't have been observation only," he added, quieter now. "That's not your decision, sir," she replied. He studied her for a long moment, not testing, measuring. "No," he said, "but I can make it change." The words landed with weight. Change wasn't always relief. Change meant scrutiny, files reopened, questions asked, the past examined under different light. "I didn't ask for it," Arya said. "I know," Hale replied. "That's why it matters." He dismissed her with a nod. Not permission, trust. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Arya lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the bass settle around her. Doors closed. Laughter drifted faintly from somewhere down the hall. She felt the day replay in fragments. The kneeling stance, the correction board, the radio clearing, the 4-mile shot. Her chest tightened, not with pride but with something closer to grief. Recognition reopened doors she'd sealed for a reason. Sierra Outpost had taught her many things. One of them was how quickly attention followed survival, and how often it asked questions she didn't want to answer. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes anyway. Morning brought no ceremony, just new assignments printed on old paper. Arya's name moved from the bottom of lists to places that carried expectation. She noticed the glances then, curious, cautious, respectful, wary. People no longer laughed, they asked. She answered only what was necessary. During the next briefing, she took a seat at the table instead of standing against the wall. No one told her to move. No one invited her either. The silence adjusted around her. The mission scenario changed. What had been a training rotation became a live preparation exercise tied to an upcoming joint operation. The terrain was similar to the valley they'd worked the day before, but farther, less forgiving. Intelligence was incomplete, weather unpredictable. Arya felt the familiar tension return, not anxiety, readiness. As maps spread across the table, she saw the flaw immediately. A blind corridor no one wanted to acknowledge because correcting it would complicate timelines. She hesitated. This was the cost of being seen. Silence no longer protected her from responsibility. "There," she said quietly, tapping the map. "That ridge shelf will shear under sustained wind. Overwatch angles won't hold." A pause followed, not dismissal, consideration. Someone asked how she knew. "I've seen it before," she replied. Not where, not when, just enough truth to be useful. They adjusted the plan. Hours later, she stood alone near the perimeter fence as the sun dipped low, painting the base in long shadows. The wind eased for the first time since morning. Stillness settled. Travis Hale approached, uncertain. He stopped a few feet away, hands awkward at his sides. "I was wrong," he said. Arya looked at him, waiting. "I didn't know," he added, as if that excused something. "No one ever does," she replied, not unkindly. He nodded, relief and discomfort mixing on his face. Apologies weren't clean. They rarely were. After he left, Arya stayed where she was. She watched the light fade. She thought of Sierra Outpost, the isolation, the nights where wind screamed so loudly it drowned thought. The times she'd trusted judgment over instruction because instruction hadn't been written for places like that. She wondered if she would ever stop carrying it alone. The answer came quietly. Maybe not. But maybe she wouldn't have to carry it unseen anymore. Recognition wasn't an ending. It was a beginning she hadn't prepared for, one that demanded she step forward again, not to prove herself, but to decide who she would be when silence was no longer an option. The wind shifted once more, gentler this time. Arya breathed it in. Tomorrow would ask something new of her. And she would be ready. What happens when the mission stops being a test and starts becoming real? The night air carried a different weight when alarms didn't sound but readiness still pressed against the skin. Arya felt it before she heard anything official. That subtle tightening in the base, the way people moved with purpose without being told why. Preparation without explanation always meant one thing: training was giving way to intent. She stood at the edge of the briefing room doorway, listening before stepping in. Habit again. Rooms spoke before people did. The low murmur inside wasn't casual, it was careful, controlled. When she entered, heads turned, not all at once, not obviously, but enough that she noticed. Her seat was already marked. That alone unsettled her more than mockery ever had. She sat. The mission unfolded across the screen in layers: terrain imagery, weather models, intermittent signal gaps marked in red. A joint task force would insert near a border corridor that intelligence described as low resistance. Arya had learned to distrust that phrase. Low resistance usually meant unseen resistance. Overwatch would be critical, distance extreme, wind unpredictable, timing narrow. The officer briefing hesitated once, then continued. Arya waited. She always waited. When the projected wind model came up, she felt the same quiet warning stir behind her ribs. The model assumed consistency where none existed. It treated the terrain like a map instead of a living thing. She raised her hand. The room stilled, not because she was senior, but because people had learned what ignoring her cost. "That model's wrong after local midnight," she said. "Thermals reverse earlier than predicted. You'll get false stability before the drop." A pause. Someone asked how certain she was. Arya didn't answer immediately. Certainty wasn't binary. It was earned in margins. "Enough to risk lives if ignored," she said. The plan adjusted. Later, alone in the equipment bay, Arya checked her rifle without ceremony. She cleaned it slowly, deliberately, grounding herself in the familiar ritual. Each pass of cloth was a breath. Each inspection a reminder that control still existed somewhere. Her hands didn't shake. They never did before a mission. They shook afterward, when it was over. Wells approached quietly, leaning against the doorway. "You don't sleep much before ops," he said. "No," Arya replied. "Neither do I," he said, "for different reasons." She glanced at him. He didn't push. He never did. "People will expect more now," he added. "They'll listen faster. They'll question less." "That's not always safer," Arya said. He smiled faintly. "You're right." The insertion night came without ceremony. No speeches, no swelling music, just movement. Arya took position hours before she needed to fire, if she needed to fire. Overwatch wasn't about shooting. It was about preventing the need to. The terrain unfolded beneath her optic like a held breath. The valley shimmered. Wind curled where rock met shadow. She read it all piece by piece, committing changes to memory. The task force moved. Then the first variable shifted. Cloud cover thickened earlier than forecast. The false stability she'd warned about arrived exactly when she expected it. Wind dropped. Everything looked calm. Arya felt her pulse slow further. Calm lied. She adjusted, preemptively calling a correction that felt wrong to those watching data feeds. No one argued. They trusted her now. Minutes later, the wind snapped sideways without warning, slamming through the corridor like a door kicked open. The correction absorbed it. Rounds stayed clear. Movement continued. One of the operators whispered over comms, "Good call." Arya didn't respond. Then something changed again. Not wind, human. A heat signature appeared where there shouldn't have been one. Stationary, patient. Arya narrowed her view, studied posture through distortion. She recognized the shape instantly. Another Overwatch. She felt something twist low in her chest, not fear. Recognition. This wasn't training, this wasn't coincidence. She alerted command quietly, adjusted angles, shifted priority. The opposing shooter moved. Arya waited. This was the part no one taught well, the pause between knowing and acting, the moment where every option carried cost. She breathed once, through her teeth. The shot wasn't dramatic, it never was. It was precise, final, necessary. The opposing Overwatch fell silent. The corridor opened fully. The team passed through unchallenged. Only then did Arya's hands begin to shake. She locked them together until it passed. Extraction followed without incident. The mission concluded cleanly. Success logged, minimal exposure. Back on base, no one celebrated loudly. They never did when they understood what had been avoided. Arya stood alone afterward, watching dawn creep across the horizon. Her chest ached now. The delayed cost, the familiar weight settling in. Wells joined her again, didn't speak, just stood. "Do you ever wish," he asked eventually, "that they hadn't noticed you?" Arya considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because being unseen meant the burden stayed simple," she replied. "Now it belongs to more than just me." Wells nodded. "That's leadership." She didn't argue, but she didn't smile either. As the sun rose, painting the sky in colors too soft for what had happened beneath them, Arya felt something shift, not relief, not pride. Acceptance. She would be seen now, questioned, relied upon. The silence she'd once hidden inside was gone. And with it came responsibility she could no longer refuse. The hardest missions didn't announce themselves with gunfire. They began when someone finally trusted you to speak, and you could no longer choose silence. What remains when the rifle is cleared, and the silence finally answers back? The base woke slowly the morning after the mission, like it didn't want to disturb what had already been paid for. Engines idled. Boots moved softer than usual. Conversations stayed low, unfinished. Arya noticed these things as she walked across the gravel toward the far perimeter, her rifle slung but empty, its weight familiar and strangely lighter now that it wasn't needed. The mission had closed cleanly. No casualties, no follow-up alerts. On paper, it was everything command wanted. In her body, it felt heavier than the long nights at Sierra Outpost ever had. She stopped near the fence line and rested her forearms against the cool metal, looking out toward the hills where the terrain folded into itself. The wind had eased, the kind of calm that came only after tension released its grip. Her hands trembled again, just slightly. She didn't fight it. Tremor meant the body had finished its job. It meant she was still human. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. She didn't turn, she knew who it was. Lieutenant Colonel Hale stopped beside her, close enough that the wind didn't carry his voice away. "You prevented escalation," he said. "Intelligence confirmed secondary elements in that corridor, if you hadn't caught the Overwatch." "I know," Arya said gently. He paused. "You don't want the commendation." It wasn't a question. "I don't want the attention it brings," she replied. "Attention is unavoidable now." Arya nodded once. That truth had settled during the night, heavy and unmoving. Being seen wasn't temporary anymore. It wouldn't fade when the mission did. Hale studied her profile. "Sierra Outpost took something from you." "Yes," she said. "And it gave you something." "Yes." "Would you do it again?" Arya didn't answer immediately. The question deserved more than reflex. "I already am," she said finally. Hale nodded, not as an officer but as someone who understood cost. He left without ceremony, letting the quiet return. Later that day, the team gathered for debrief. Not the formal kind, the real one. No slides, no rehearsed language, just people speaking in fragments, filling gaps where fear had lived hours earlier. Arya listened more than she spoke. When someone thanked her directly, she met their eyes and accepted it without deflection. That was new. She didn't apologize for existing anymore. She didn't minimize the truth to protect others from discomfort. Growth didn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looked like allowing yourself to be acknowledged without shrinking. That evening, as the base lights flickered on, Arya packed her gear slowly. Each item returned to its place, each motion deliberate. The wrist wrap came off last. She flexed her hand, feeling the ache beneath. The ache reminded her she was alive. She thought of the first day on the ridge, the laughter, the assumptions, the way silence had wrapped around her like armor because nothing else was offered. She had survived inside that silence. She had sharpened herself there. But silence had limits. She realized now that being unseen hadn't protected her. It had only postponed the moment responsibility arrived. And responsibility, once earned, didn't leave. Wells found her as she zipped her bag. "You heading out?" "For a walk," she said. He nodded. "You'll come back?" "Yes." He hesitated. "They'll look to you now, younger ones, ones who don't look like they belong yet." Arya paused. The thought landed somewhere deep. "I know," she said. She stepped outside as dusk settled, the sky bruised purple and gold. The wind brushed past her, gentler than before. She walked beyond the lights, letting the quiet expand around her, not the old silence of dismissal, but a new one, chosen, grounded. She thought of all the moments that had built her. Nights with no witnesses, decisions made without applause, corrections scribbled small enough to be ignored until they were. She understood something then. Strength wasn't about being underestimated or finally recognized. It was about showing up prepared whether anyone believed in you or not. It was about carrying experience quietly until the moment demanded it aloud. Arya stopped at the edge of the path and looked back once at the base behind her. Lights steady, people moving, life continuing. Tomorrow there would be new missions, new assumptions, new tests that wouldn't announce themselves. She would meet them the same way she always had. Steady, unseen if necessary, seen if required. Because dignity didn't need permission. Sometimes it didn't speak at all. It simply acted.